Well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming back for our first afternoon session of the Hunger Symposium. To my right, I have an esteemed panel here going to speak to us about their work in the field with a wide variety of experiences. So I look forward to hearing their presentations. So we're going to go ahead and start right at it. We're going to begin with Dr. Grace Ju Miller here to my immediate right. Dr. Miller grew up in the Philippines. She studied botany and art at Duke University and worked for Young Life Wilderness Ranch in Colorado for 6 summers. She was a park ranger at Cape Lookout National Seashore and spent a semester at Duke Marine Lab. She spent 1.5 years in Taiwan learning Mandarin and conducting research at the Institute of Botany, Academia Sinica. She received her Master's of Science in Agronomy from the UC Davis and a PhD in horticulture from Purdue. Dr. Miller also worked for a biotech company in California for 1 year, and she was a postdoc at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, as well as taught at Gordon College for 11 years. She worked as a seed bank director for Echo Farm in Florida for 4 years and taught in Morocco for another 2 years. She is now a professor of biology at Indiana Wesleyan University, and she is married with 2 children and has directed an international course called Sustainable Tropical Biology for the past 14 years. She has taken students to Haiti, Nicaragua, and Honduras to study agriculture. Dr. Miller?
I wasn't sure how this was all going to be arranged, so I usually talk standing, so I think the expectancy was sitting, but when you're vertically challenged, standing is a lot better option. At least you can see me. So, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you, the Hunger Symposium, for inviting me today. I'm excited to share a passion that I have, and that is soil. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is some of the pet peeves I have. I don't have a lot, but one of them is when I hear somebody call it dirt. Okay? I had an agronomy professor at UC Davis who said dirt has a connotation that it's something to get rid of, something you sweep away. Soil is something you keep and value. That's what he taught me. So if you still have the habit of calling it dirt, it's okay, I still love you, but you may want to think about what I just shared. You notice my title is a little bit ambiguous because, first of all, I'm going to talk about soil in the tropics, and there's no junipers there. So this verse is actually from Isaiah 41:19, junipers in the wasteland. And here's the complete verse. It says, "The poor and needy search for water, but there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst. But I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will make rivers flow on barren heights and springs within the valleys. I will turn the desert into pools of water and the parched ground into springs. I will put in the desert the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set junipers in the wasteland." And that's where I get this title, Junipers in the Wasteland. Junipers in the wasteland, the fir and the cypress together, so that people may see and know, may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, that the Holy One of Israel has created it. One of the things I want to start off right away is to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to be sharing with you is a group effort of many people in my field. It's not just my ideas. And most of all, that it's really God who gave all of us those ideas to share in humility, that we can somehow try to together tackle some of the issues today. Agriculture. I know there's no agriculture major here, so I felt a little bit confident I could talk about agriculture at Wheaton. Be a little bit more intimidating if I did that at Purdue. But, God has given us so much. In Genesis, it says, "I give you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in it as fruit. You shall have them for food. Genesis 1:29. And in fact, there's at least 350,000 species of plants in the world. So let me get a raise of hand if you want to try to answer this question. How many of these 350,000 species of plants in the world are in your diet today? Somebody want to volunteer? How many?
7,000.
7,000? In your diet here at Wheaton? I'm impressed. I knew you had a good cafeteria, but wow. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
200.
About 200? It depends really on, like I said, what culture you're in. But really, about 30 to 35 species give us the majority of our calories in the world today. So if you ask me, that's not a lot of creativity compared to the 350,000 that God made. In fact, the FAO says there's more than 7,000, that's right, you got it, you're good at reading slides, 7,000 plant species that have been used for human consumption. And then here's what it says, yet a large number of crops that are now overlooked have the potential to play a more important role in sustaining livelihoods and enhancing environmental health. And that's what this is all about in my talk. Food, health, and all of that because we're basing this on the fact that we are made in the image of God, we have Christ in our heart, and we want to love. You know, underlying all this is not the soil, it's not the program, it's not the management method, foundations in farming God's way, farmer-managed regeneration of natural resources. It's about love. So what's the soil? Again, it's not dirt. It's actually, for most of us, you might not even realize this is your lifeline. This is our income. This is our inheritance. This is our savings. You lose this, you lose all those 4 things. Think about it. That's where your food comes from. And without food, it doesn't matter if you're in a Fortune 500 company. You have to eat. Okay. In fact, because it's so valuable, care for the soil means care for the plants. Care for the plants means care for the people. And so I'm going to just quickly do an overview of some of the many, many farming systems out there that will help us with food security and with environmental sustainability. You've heard some of these already last night in Craig's presentation, which was very inspiring. Agroforestry. Basically, agroforestry is farming with considering trees, using trees. And it could be trees for woodlots, for firewood. It could be trees that bear perennial fruits. It could be trees for soil erosion control or adding nitrogen to the soil. SALT is sloping agricultural land technology, and obviously that's only going to help you if you have a slope. Farming God's Way, we heard some of that. It's also called Foundations in Farming. And an FMNR, which is Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, and this is something that Tony Ronaldo's group at World Vision have spread in many continents. And then I thought I'd throw in 2 interesting heroes of mine. You might have heard of them. How many have heard of Gordon Sato? No one. He's an interesting molecular biologist who had a second career after he retired. He was in the era of Watson and Crick, but after he retired, he kind of went, so what's the biggest problem facing the world? Any scientists out here? Raise your hand if you're in sciences. You kind of like an ostrich, and when you're done with your research, you look up, and you kind of go, oh, so what's the rest of the world doing? And so they said, oh, well, one of the biggest problems in the world is malnutrition and hunger. And he goes, oh, really? I've been in a lab at UCLA, so okay. Where? And someone said, Ethiopia. So he flies out to Ethiopia, and he realizes that this is true. And you'll see the story in just a minute. And then Yakuba Has anybody seen the video, The Man Who Stopped the Desert? No? It's a must-see. Get it on Netflix. But all this is because of what I'm going to say about this teaspoon of soil. Okay? This is your inheritance. This is the inheritance of the farmer in Honduras. This is the inheritance of the farmer in Burkina Faso. This teaspoon of soil, of good soil, has over 1 billion organisms in it. Can you wrap your head around that? 1 billion little critters live there. It's not dirt. It's the Who's in Whoville. Do you guys know Dr. Seuss? They're little guys living in there and gals, and they are happy, and they're doing their thing, and going to school, and going to PTA meetings and stuff. And that's why when I talk about till and no-till, you have to think about what you're doing to the Who's in Whoville when that plow goes. Those Who's in Whovilles are like going like this, you know? 3rd grade in Whoville has stopped. So there's all those Who's in Whoville in that teaspoon of soil. And so in that soil is life. You think about life above ground, how your corn is doing above ground, how your sorghum is doing above ground. You got to be thinking about what's it doing beneath, because what's beneath is going to affect what's above. So take care of the soil, take care of the soil food web, take care of the life in the soil, and you'll have no problem being able to take care of your plants. And here's my illustration of the Who's in Whoville. The Who's, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, beetles, you name it, they're all in there. And they're doing a good thing. They're breaking things down. They're producing nutrients. It's a two-way street. They're taking stuff from the plants and they're giving back stuff to the plants. So this is a slide borrowed from Dr. Ingram, but look at that. Think of those roots as giving out goodies to that village that's underground. It's a two-way street. So let's go back to some of these examples. Quickly, farmer-managed natural regeneration is basically this idea that what looks like a desolate field of stumps of trees that have been over-harvested and have been chopped up for wood is actually a gold mine of firewood. And what Tony Rinaldo and some other scientists have found out is if you go back, the stumps will regenerate. The problem is if you have overgrazing, as soon as they regenerate, they're eaten or they're cut for firewood. So if you can educate and say, let that stump regenerate, cut back some of the smaller limbs and allow one or two to mature, you can regenerate the forest. And why is this important? Because the wood is being cut for fuel. So unless we solve that problem, you're gonna be looking for more and more and more trees when you in fact have the trees right there. But hand in hand with this, I will add that you also, even if you regenerate this forest, if you don't have fuel-efficient stoves, you're back to the square one. So what I have there is a picture of fuel-efficient rocket stove designs. And so from a wasteland, you can regenerate the junipers, okay? And if you don't have fuel-efficient stove, at least you can use these fireless stove that Tony Rinaldo showed last night. His was a little bit fancier basket with nice fabric lining. This is just an old cardboard shipping box that's been stuffed with t-shirts and socks. Now, Jacobi was a man who is in Burkina Faso, and he started to practice Zaiholes, Z-A-I-H-O-L-E-S. And he started to plant and get the land ready before the tradition, and he took fertilizer from termite hills and put it in each holes. But the bottom line here is whatever he did, he was able to gain more productivity from his soil, regenerate the forest, plant more trees, and the best place to store water is in the ground, so as the trees, the vegetation stayed on the ground, the rainwater stayed in his land. Okay, I'll quickly go through this. Gordon Sato, He went to Eritrea and he discovered that camels ate mangroves. They would go up to the water. He says, if camels can't eat mangroves, then why can't the goats? And then so he started to farm mangroves. And he farmed mangroves all along the shore of Eritrea and was able to get lots of high protein and nutrition for the goats. And the goats then could produce milk and meat and has transformed this place. And ecologically, the shoreline has now more fish and the fisheries has increased. Farming God's Way, you heard last night, is a great method that incorporates biblical training and theology. And I love the way they call that topsoil God's blanket. I don't have the Zimbabwean accent, but it's God's blanket. And Grant, he talks about this in his seminars. He goes, you've got to protect God's blanket, And it's true. It's true. But with that, they teach that you want to be on time in your planting, have high standards, without wastage, and lastly, but not least, with joy. And you can see these planting stations, they're clearly marked and very precise. Most importantly is if you keep the ground covered, you decrease erosion, you increase the retention of the water, you keep the soil temperature down, and in fact, this is how God farms. Just like Craig said last night, you go to a forest in Illinois or Michigan, that's how God doesn't rake, he doesn't mow, he doesn't plow. Let's see, next slide. Okay, and this is SALT, Sloping Agricultural Land Technology. This is an example in Rancho Ebenezer, Nicaragua, where I've taken students to. You can see that's this exact same slope 2 years later. Oops, I need to skip one. And what happens is these are my students marking out the contours with an A-frame. A-frame is made with just 2 sticks, 3 sticks to make the letter A, and then a plumb line. And it's a surveying tool to mark out the contour. Okay, lastly, I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience with SALT. How am I doing in time? Okay. With Larry Smoke. He is a graduate of Wheaton, and we had this conversation today at lunch about the value of a liberal arts education. Well, Larry is not really doing anything related to his liberal arts major here, but he is doing far more. But he's located outside La Ceiba in Las Mangas, and my students and I have gone there 5 times to help him with the SALT. And for years, he tried to demonstrate sustainable agriculture with the SALT technique. And so when my students went there, they were like, oh, you must have like dozens of farmers who are doing this because this is such a great idea. And he said, I have 0. And of course, typical of my students, you guys would never say anything as crass as that. They go, so you've done nothing in 12 years? You've accomplished nothing? Well, program-wise, that's true. But people-wise, he's given so much and received so much in 12 years. And that was a lesson we could all learn, because I teach a class, it's academic, it's about sustainable tropical agriculture. We've had all the slideshows and all the workshops, but living with Larry and Allison teaches us about transformational ministry. It's not about the program, it's about the people. So he started out, wasn't a biology major here, so he heard about salt, he heard about nitrogen fixation in trees, so he tried using Gliricidia. It's a leguminous tree in his salt technique. It was hard to find Gliricidia seedlings and trees. It was very frustrating for him. And then one day, he just looked at his hillside in Honduras and realized that there's a leguminous tree that grows right on the hill. And it's called Inga, or guana. So he started planting a native leguminous tree, and the project took off. And in fact, the project is now run by another foundation called the Inga Foundation, where they are doing the salt technique, rejuvenating this land, this wasteland, planting, in a sense, junipers in the wasteland, except they're Inga, which is also called ice cream bean, a wonderful name if you like ice cream. I've had it. It does kind of taste like vanilla ice cream. the flesh does. And they've also started to plant black pepper and mahogany. So quickly here, we see an A-frame being made by the students. That's the hillside. That's a traditional slash and burn, very steep. These are so steep. When you're standing on there, your legs start shaking because it's like being in this step hold, like you're backpacking for hours. I asked if farmers ever fall off, and they said, yeah, so do cattle. And we're filling up bags in order to get ready for the Inga seedlings. Here's an Inga nursery, and on the bottom there, with a dibble stick, we're putting all the Inga seeds in. And then we hike up with our bags of Inga seedlings up this steep slope, and you can see we're doing the A-frame to do the contour. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay. And that's what the seedlings look like. And this is a guy from the Inga Foundation. And it's really helped Larry's ministry because he's just one man, and Inga Foundation is huge, and so they've been able to take the very little seeds he planted 12 years ago and really take off in this area. And you can see how steep that is, that we're all standing there. But there we are, we're creating God's blanket. Those Inga leaves are huge. They drop, they make 2 or 3 centimeters deep of leaves that begin to decompose. I don't know if you can see it, that my students and I are sitting in the shade of Inga trees that were planted in Larry's farm about 3 years ago. And they have matured, and now they become like living fences where we crisscross the branches, and it holds the soil back for erosion. That's Toyano, and he's now come behind us, and with a planting stick, he's putting corn in. And you see that we've coppiced the Inga. It looks like they're dead, but they will regenerate branches. And look at that. You see that? That's good stuff. That's exactly how the forest in Michigan looks. It's full of leaf litter. We just let it sit there. The branches we take down the hill and make charcoal. And Inga is a nitrogen fixing, has nitrogen fixing bacteria, symbiotic in their roots. And now where those leaves are, it will decompose in tropics very quickly, and that makes really rich soil. You see my hand holding that dark soil that used to be so barren before. So there's the Inga Foundation. If you're interested, ingafoundation.org. You can find information there. So to me, this is just a visual as I take my students on these international courses as an example of redemption, as an example of what it said in Isaiah, that God can do this. God can restore the wasteland in our lives, in the life of the soil, and he has chosen to partner with us in this work. And this is just what it is, the action of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. You know, he can turn things around. What was a selfish and ignorant way to plant, or at least to not be sustainable, he can turn that around, and it's a redemptive thing. Oops. Sorry. And it's also fun because we got to make tortillas in these fuel-efficient stoves. I wasn't very good at it. I almost dropped one, but I caught it inches from the ground. And here we are spending some time with Toyana's family. And one thing all of us shared with the mountains of Honduras are beautiful. But after spending 10 days there working with the farmers, we could not look at those mountains without realizing there's a lot of pain. Because this is the land that they have to plant their rice, their corn and beans. And it's beauty with pain. So I'll finish with this. I hope that you will see that the work that we are all involved with is redemptive work, whether you stay in Chicago, whether you go to Las Mangas, but that you'll be encouraged that there's good news out there. There's good progress. I'll end with this story about Larry. My students and I were there. They broke into our dorms. Somebody did, and stole my students' iPod and a pair of shoes that were apparently very expensive. They were from Italy. And she was very upset, and she said, do you know who did this? And Larry says, I think so. She goes, let's go after him. Let's go get the police. And Larry said, no. And this young lady said, what are you talking about? He stole my stuff. Larry said, I've known this boy since he was 12. I've discipled him. I know the pain he has had. If we call the police, they will find him and they will beat him to death because they love me and they are ashamed that this happened to my guests. I know it is a loss for you to lose these shoes and your iPod, but it is not worth his life. So pray for him, pray for me as I walk up to the mountain to find him. And just remember that it's about this boy's life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Our second panelist is going to share with us today is Chris Prokop. Chris Prokop manages the production of over 18,000 pounds of produce annually for women, infants, and children through produce boxes and other market sales. As a grower, Chris works with 80 to 100 inmates per year, instructing them in sustainable farming practices and preparing them for post-release work in the organization Windy City's Harvest Transitional Jobs Program. Chris enrolled them in the Windy City Harvest class of 2010 after experimenting with farming and season extension in his backyard. His internship at the Vocational Rehabilitation Impact Center, or VRIC, provided the opportunity to mentor inmates while cultivating his own passion for farming. Chris earned a degree in sociology from Harold Washington College in 2009. Chris?
Hello? How's everybody doing? First of all, is anyone familiar with our programs, Windy City Harvest, or the Chicago Botanic Garden for that matter? Okay, great, cool. I hope that this doesn't come off as a promotional video for our programming, but I think you'll realize at the end that it's through these sites that we have and how we run our programs that for our topic today, urban soils, it all makes sense at the end. Sorry. So just a little overview of our programming. There's three main components. One of them being Harvest Corps, which is our job training. It's a transitional jobs program for, before we worked with inmates from a alternative sentencing facility called the Vocational Rehabilitation Impact Center. These are primarily young men between the ages of 17 and 35, young non-violent offenders. We work with about 30 of them a year. So that's the Harvest Corps. Then we have the 9-month apprenticeship, which is a training program in urban ag. And then we have our incubator farm program, which is a program designed to give individuals with farming business ideas, land and resources to carry out their vision. Here's some stats. We basically farm on probably under about 4 acres right now on 5 different sites. There's some numbers there, and in 2003, we harvested about 65,000 pounds of produce off of probably about 3 acres of land in production. So I'm just gonna go through the sites real quickly and then kind of go back to the sites at the end. But this is some pictures of our training facility. It's a partnership that we have with the City Colleges of Chicago. This one is Arturo Velasquez Institute. So when you take the program, you get a certificate from the Botanic Garden as well as City Colleges. This is where I used to work. That bio is a little bit outdated, but this is a picture of the farm inside the prison. It's a division of the Cook County Jail. I don't know if I mentioned that. There was also a aquaponics system in one of those buildings in the back. And all this produce goes to serve the WIC program, which stands for Women, Infants, and Children. Here's another site that we have at Kraft Corporate Headquarters. Here's our rodeo farm. which is across the street from an actual rodeo. That's why it's called that. But this is actually also close to the grounds of the Cook County Jail. It's a pretty large site. It's about 2 acres, with half of it being devoted to vegetable production and the other half being devoted to composting. Here's one of our newest sites. We actually just acquired a ½ acre on top of McCormick Place, and with the potential to take over 3 acres. So we're currently converting an already present green roof into vegetable production, which I'll go over later. And then here's where I work at now. This is the incubator farm. It's our largest site. It's about 2¼ acres. It's split up into 8 different plots that are an 1/8 acre large. Since we are talking about soil, there's a number for you, 1,680 cubic feet of soil. So the reason why we're talking about urban soils and what makes them unique is usually soil contamination issues. Here's a nice little fancy graph on lead levels. Lead is, the heavy metal that most people are concerned about in urban soils. So really, there's a lot of land that's available in the city for use, but there's a reason for it usually, and usually comes down to contamination and what was grown previously on the site. So if you are looking to acquire some land in the city, your first step would be to access the history of the site and go on from there. Here is some typical land use, historical land uses. I can tell you from this list that one of our Green Youth Farm sites is actually on top of an old dry cleaner facility. And that VRIC site is a former site of a landfill. And so these are very real things that happen all the time where, it's kind of, I don't know how you might want to think about it, but it's possible actually to grow food for consumption on top of these kind of places. But I mean, those are typical contaminants to solvents, petroleum. So that's what we're dealing with here. It's pretty harsh stuff. And here's the effects. Obviously, cancer, liver, nerve damage, asthma is a big one in the city. And I'm sure I get my tetanus shot every couple of years. We'll go on. Exposure pathways. So this is an interesting one in that really there's 3 different ways. It's through contact through your skin, through inhaling dust, and through actually eating the fruit or the plants that you're growing. Out of these 3, by far you'll get sick from the most is the inhalation of dust particles, which is why I'll show you what we do about that later. But really, the eating of the fruit that is that you may think might be contaminated, that's probably the least thing to be concerned about. So your first step is assessing the history, right, of your site, and the next step would be to take your soil analysis. Most normally, people take soil analysis of their soil as a growing medium. What nutrients, nutrient levels do we have? What may we need to amend with? But when you're talking about soil contamination, you want to talk about contaminant concentrations. So we use A&L Great Lakes Laboratories. They're based out of, I think out of Michigan. And they have a great breakdown of what you can test for if you're actually really concerned. Like for example, on the dry cleaning site, we're going to be testing primarily for cleaning solvents. If we were putting a site on top of a old gas station site, we'd probably be testing for lead and petroleum. So then, there's different methods of soil sampling, and they yield different results. And this is kind of important to be aware of, but you might want to contact a professional when evaluating your soil test, because there is the extraction method of extracting the, let's say, heavy metals to get your test results. But really what you want to be concerned about is the bioavailability of the contaminants. So you could have lead in your soil, but is it readily accessible? Is it actually going to be drawn up through the plant, which is a big thing. Okay, and then there's methods, right, of remediation. And, the most common are biological and the physical. The soil mending, just by adding compost to your soil, you are doing some sort of remediation, which is really interesting to think about. Just adding organic matter will tie up and bind those heavy metals if you do have them in your soils. So that's important to think about. Compost is a great thing. There's phytoremediation, which is pretty interesting. It's basically growing plants that will kind of absorb these heavy metals, such as sunflowers and amaranth are popular ones. The efficacy of those tests have been shown to be spotty, and you're basically growing plants that will end up in landfills, so there's that whole thing. And then there's physical, which is really just excavating the soil, and that's a lot of work. And there's cap and fill, which we'll discuss later. And then there's non-remedial, which is much easier, and it's what we do. And then there's also just non-remedial methods that don't even involve soil. So one way of dealing with soil contamination issues is to not grow in soil at all, if you think about it. So here's cap and fill. This is a popular one in the city. This is a picture of City Farm. And basically what they do is they remove a level of soil, maybe a couple feet, and then they cap it off with a clay or maybe a rock or some type of mulch barrier, and then they put another mulch layer on top of that, and then their compost. So you can do this, but it kind of makes the site a little less easy to transfer should you have to move, which is a popular occurrence in urban farms, in that the land is pretty expensive and you might be kicked off of it pretty soon. So this is kind of our preferred method, and that is when we get a site, we basically cover the entire site with this EPA-certified Geo Textile fabric. It's not cheap, but it is effective. And then we build raised beds on top of that, and then we actually purchase compost from composting facilities outside to fill it. So this is kind of like cheating. It's not actual farming. We're not doing a lot of soil building here, but it's our response, and it is effective, and it has proven to work. We grow directly in compost, so we actually get a very, very high yield from our soils. And then this is an example of Geo Textiles. These are permeable fabrics, synthetic based. What they allow is for drainage, from watering and rains and such, but they don't allow uptake of contaminants from the plants. So here's some of our other responses. We have aquaponics, we have the McCormick, and the compost. Anybody familiar with aquaponics? Yeah. Aquaponics is the combination of aquaculture, which is raising fish, and hydroponics, which is growing plants in some sort of medium other than water. It's interesting, and it's definitely being tested right now on large scales throughout the city. There's a site in Bedford Park. It's a 95,000 square foot warehouse that is being completely dedicated to aquaponic basil and arugula and green production. It's called Farmed Here. I'd check it out if you're interested. But we have a small aquaponics installation at the school, as well as one at the jail. So we basically raise fish. The fish waste provides the nutrients for the plants, and then the plants in turn actually help filter the water for the fish. So it's this very symbiotic, closed loop system that is really interesting when it works. It's a beautiful thing, mimicking nature. We have our rooftop, so I'm going back to the rooftop, which is interesting because we're making our own soil up there. We're making our own type of soil growing medium, and we're using some of the pre-existing media, which is primarily just like clay-based, I forget the name of the plant that they usually grow up there in those rooftops, but we had to rip all that out, and we're adding our own blend of compost and vermicompost, and we're actually creating our own vermicompost using these like 35 cubic foot vermicomposting containers. Vermicomposting is worm castings. I don't know if you guys are aware, but it is actually raising worms and using their waste as their byproducts for soil. So yeah, there's a picture of one of our large-scale vermicomposting bins. You can actually add 35 pounds of vegetable matter to it per day, which is pretty crazy to think about. Those worms work really hard. And then large scale, so we do have our own composting site. We do what we can, but it really doesn't meet the needs of the type of growing that we do. We produce about 30 to 50 cubic yards per year, and that's pretty good for us. So we do compost all of our waste from all of our sites and all of our farms, but we still have to purchase outside compost. And then I just threw this slide in here at the end. If you guys are doing some gardening at home and are concerned at all about these things, it's real important to maintain certain pH levels and maintain a pretty base 7 pH. That'll prevent some of the metals from being taken up. Always wear gloves or wash your hands before consuming food, and try not to breathe the soil in or the dust and all that. Fruiting crops, they tend to contain less contaminants than the rooting vegetables, or the ones that are growing in the ground. And then I don't know how much you guys raise livestock out here, but if you're concerned, you just have to build up a base layer once again, and keep those guys out of the ground. And then a lot of the info for this is on an EPA document about brownfields and urban agriculture. We've done our own research as well, so that's about it.
Thank you, Chris. Our final two panelists are Peggy and Jeff Boshart. Jeff grew up catching frogs, watching birds, and hiking under the hemlocks every summer at camp at his beloved Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania. He finished his biology studies at Juniata College and served at various Church of the Brethren camps, and then Echo in North Fort Myers, Florida. Meanwhile, Peggy was showing sheep at the county fair in Wisconsin and helped on her family's farm. Though she studied biology at Wheaton College, it was her work at Echo that helped combine her love for agriculture and interest in helping people. After interning at Echo, Jeff and Peggy studied at Cornell University and then served for 5 years in Haiti and the Dominican Republic in the field of community development. When Jeff isn't pulling weeds, he works for the Church of the Brethren at their Global Food Crisis Fund manager. Peggy tends an acre of organic vegetables, an acre of mixed fruits, and her 2 children.
I'm going to go first and try to keep it short because I think what Peggy has to say is more interesting. At least it is to me. And I know you've been sitting for a little bit, so I want to do a little exercise for you all. I'm going to ask you some questions and then have you stand up, depending on how you answer the question. So the first question I'm going to ask is there anybody out here who currently lives on a farm? Currently lives on a farm, please stand up. Or when you're not here at school, you live on a farm. Okay. All right, you can stay standing. You can stay standing. All right. How many of you have parents who grew up on a farm? If you can stand up. Okay. Now, how many of you have grandparents who grew up on a farm? All right. Okay, you may sit down. All right. So you can get a little bit of an idea the generational gap we have between ourselves, many of us. I would count myself, my grandparents, I think, were the last ones in my family to have come from any kind of farming background. So how far most of us are in this country from the land, from any kind of a land ethic or a concern for soils that comes from being farmers. How many people here, and you can stand up if you've ever heard this word, locavore? You've heard of carnivores? Okay, locavores. All right, good. Hey, very good. Okay. Locavores, people who are very concerned and try to eat as much as they can that is sourced, food that is sourced locally. Locavore. Good for you. I didn't know that word until not too long ago, but of course Peggy knew it. So, as it was mentioned, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I don't want to talk too much about the work that I do. I'm more interested in talking a little bit about my passion. And my passion is growing things, growing trees, growing vegetables, and also being in God's creation and learning about and caring for God's creation. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I learned a lot of the same lessons and care for creation that I think you heard last night from Craig, that he was learning in East Africa, watching wildlife. And a lot of young boys and girls do that. They get into the soil, they get into the creeks, they get into the lakes, the streams, and they learn a lot. That way, hands-on. My passion for growing things came a lot later, but my concern for the care of creation was instilled in me by Christian camp counselors and by my dad, who was a pretty crazy bird watcher. And I was often drug along on bird watching trips. I distinctly remember, though, when I was 4 years old, my dad, who was an elementary music teacher, took a summer job at a local Christian camp. And he was the nature teacher for all the kids that summer. And a couple nights he let me actually sleep out with him in the nature lodge, where they had snakes and turtles and frogs and those sorts of things. And I remember waking up one morning to the sound of screaming baby birds. There was a nest of phoebes, a flycatcher-like bird, in the rafters of the nature lodge, and one of our largest black rat snakes had gotten out of its cage somehow and was up in the rafters doing its best to get to the nest. And the mother, I don't remember there being two, but one of the parents was there valiantly defending her or his young from this 6-foot black rat snake. And I ran as fast as I could and found the first adult that I could find. And my dad, for some reason, wasn't around. And they came and wasn't around. I didn't want to see what happened. But I think they said they rescued most of them. Or maybe they told me that because they didn't want me to know what really happened. But that passion continued with me, and it grew. I worked at summer camps. I worked in environmental education after college. I spent time at ECHO. I spent time at Cornell, went overseas, worked in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, worked with farmers. And then along the way, I met Peggy. And she said something while we were just dating about that she probably would want to go back and live on a farm. And I never had that anywhere in my mind that I would end up on a farm someday. But here we are, and we're now living in southern Wisconsin, and I work for the Church of the Brethren, which is a denomination, about 1,000 churches across the country, and they have community development work, and they support mission work around the globe, and so I have a job doing that. But my dream is to quit that job and be able to go to work for Peggy full-time. So I want to just say a little bit about the local food movement and its impact on soil health, and Peggy's going to talk about that as well. The story might be otherwise titled Riches to Rags, instead of Rags to Riches, and I'll let Peggy talk about that as well. But there's a quote that I picked up from a writer who writes for the BBC, and she said, "Food really matters. How you eat, how you shop, crucially affects how the world is. Our decisions every day with our dollar affect someone somewhere in the world." The local food movement, and I heard that my wife was at a table this morning where she was with an anthropology professor who was talking about how many people are interested in farming these days, young people, and wondering where this came from. And I also have those same kinds of questions. I haven't thought about them probably nearly as profoundly or deeply or as long as the anthropology professor who was eating with my wife, but I do think about those questions, and I came up with some of my best shots at where this interest is, where it's come from for local foods, the local food movement. I think there's somewhat of a stream. There's always been a stream of some folks here in the United States who want to support local business, no matter what it is, any sort of local business. I had a grandfather who was a union organizer here in the different parts around the upper Midwest, and he would, whatever factory he was in, throughout his working career, he would always either start unions or be very involved with unions. And he got on me once for having, when I bought my first car, it was a beat-up Datsun, and made some comment about, well, there's jobs, those jobs could have gone to an American worker. So that might be one stream of the buy local phenomenon. Another would be the health craze, health concerns. I have an aunt who is in her late 70s, but she will tell us, the rest of us in the family, that we need to eat better, constantly tells us that. She is very certain that she was cured of cancer from her diet. She is very certain of that, and will tell us all that she is sure of that. And she's also sells Shaklee products, so if any of you know Shaklee. And so she has tried to make her whole lifestyle built around being healthy. So that might be another stream that's feeding into the locavore movement, or the local food movement. The environmental movement of the 60s, 70s, I was obviously, as a young person growing up at camp in the 70s every summer, who were the camp counselors? They were college students coming back from universities where they were learning all about this kind of newfangled thing called ecology in the 70s. And they were my camp counselors, and I thought they were pretty cool. So I was obviously influenced by the environmental movement. In the 80s, I worked at an environmental education center in Ohio, and another one in Oregon as a volunteer. So I was pretty much indoctrinated into at least in the Christian environmental movement. Some would say that that's an oxymoron, but I think it's a reality. Maybe there's another stream might be a backlash to globalization. The local food movement is not new. The globalized food system is new. That's new. In human history, food has never traveled around the globe like it does today. That's what's new. These crops here on the table are all things that came from our garden. We have some dried apples here. We have some dried beans, parsnips, rutabagas, carrots, potatoes, shameless product placement here. My family in Pennsylvania makes apple butter, and they have for generations. This is a business started by my great-grandfather in the 1800s and is still being run today by, I have an uncle They have a cider press and a sawmill and a number of things there. So these are all locally produced foods. Canning would have been my grandmother's house in Pennsylvania. As I think back on it, was built for local foods. They had what she called a shanty. It was a cold, unheated room off the porch, off the kitchen, and that's where she kept a lot of things. A house we rented in Pennsylvania when we were first married my wife was telling me this, I didn't even remember it, had a trapdoor on the porch. And you could go down in the basement. There was a root cellar under the porch that led into a room off of the basement. That was the local food movement of my grandparents' generation and before them. The globalized food movement is new. And I think there might be somewhat of a backlash against that. And I think there are a lot of older folks, and this is where I'm going to kind of transition to my wife and her work at the farmer's market and on our farm. There's a lot of older folks who just remember fondly what it was like when they were young, going to market and knowing their vendor and knowing who's growing their food. And so I don't know exactly where the local food movement has come from, but that's my best stab at a bunch of different possible streams that may have come together. But now we live on a farm, and we are becoming more and more dependent for our own livelihood on the local food movement. And so I'm going to have my wife talk about it.
I just wanted to real briefly share my story at Wheaton. This was about 20 years ago. I was a biology student here, and growing up on a farm, I'd always enjoyed agriculture, growing things, and I thought studying biology would be really cool because I thought it would all be about studying living things, and it was. The classes I took here were very interesting, but I realized through my time here that there was really no one I could talk to about agriculture. There weren't any professors that I knew who had any connections to agriculture. There weren't any students I knew who had any connections to agriculture, and I kind of got the feeling over time, maybe agriculture is just kind of a dead and dying thing, that there's really no place for it in this world anymore. And while I really appreciated a lot of things about my Wheaton education, I came to my senior year feeling like, okay, what's the next step here? I'm not pre-med. I'm not going to go on to graduate school to study molecular biology. I'm not really sure what to do next. So thankfully, outside the biology department, there was a bulletin board that had lists of internships and opportunities. And so I saw this little blurb about a place in Florida called Echo. I thought, oh, well, this sounds kind of interesting. Tropical agriculture. I have no idea about anything about tropical agriculture, but I got their VHS tape that they sent me and put that in and watched their homemade video about Echo and applied. And I realized when I got there, wow, this was a place where I could finally combine my interests of helping other people, serving other people, and my passion for growing things, for agriculture. And it was through my time there then I realized that agriculture is an honorable profession. It's an honorable thing to do. And from there then, I'll fast forward to our farm. We were blessed that my parents own land in Wisconsin, and so 5 years ago we moved there and subdivided off a piece of land. So here's a picture of the farm. Obviously, this was not a current picture because there's a lot of snow on the ground right now. But our garden then, it was always our desire to have a market garden and to sell things after we had been working overseas with farmers and teaching them how to grow better vegetables, and thought, oh, you know what, maybe I should actually try to make a business of this out of my, try it myself instead of just telling other people how to do it. So our garden was literally carved out of, wait a minute, there we go, a cornfield, and the land had been conventionally farmed by my father, and so it was really hard, compacted clay, like concrete. I mean, to get a shovel in it was it was really hard work the first year turning soil. Had heavy equipment had been put over it. It had been, pretty much everything is GMO corn and soybeans these days, so lots of herbicides applied. So it was really a lot of work. But over time, as any good organic gardener knows, you scrounge everywhere you can for organic matter. That's what builds your soil. And so there's a trailer park down the road from us, and so we'd go and get bags of leaves that people would put out. We have dairy farms around us, so we had some dairy farmers clean out their barns and bring us piles of manure. I mean, we've even been known to stop at the side of the road if people have bags of grass clippings and stop and get their grass clippings. It's kind of like gardeners dumpster diving, but you swipe stuff from people's front yards. Any organic matter you can get, you used in your garden. And so now, 5 years on, we're reaping the benefits of finally soil that you can stick your hand in. You don't need a pickaxe to work up. Earthworms. We put mulch on in the beginning of the growing season after we planted our seedlings, and after about a month and a half, it's gone. Where did it all go? It was all eaten by worms. It's remarkable. When we first started, there was no life, not either in the soil or just around. There was no place for insects, for reptiles, amphibians, anything to find a home. And now, 5 years on, with a different kind of farming system, we're enjoying all kinds of living things around us, from lots of birds and insects to, frequently when I'm in the garden, there's hummingbirds flying around, goldfinches. There's a toad in there. We get wood peepers, which is wood frogs in our garden, as well as American toads. This last spring, my son and daughter enjoyed finding a tiger salamander right by the garden. So these are all benefits that we're seeing now with a lot of work and organic material put in. So we have about an acre that we are growing intensively, all by hand. We don't use any tractors. I have an aversion to tractors after sitting in, as my dad, when I was a kid, he'd spend all his time fixing equipment. So after a while, you just get tired of, another thing broke down. So we also have a couple of hoop houses, which are a newer technology that market gardeners are using now to extend their seasons, both here and overseas. They use it a lot. So the benefits to our family then extend not only for good produce for our family and fun for my kids, but also selling the produce then at local farmers markets. We live in a small town. It's about 10,000 people in southern Wisconsin, but they've worked really hard at making the farmers market a point for community to happen. And so they have local musicians come and play every week, and there's lots of local producers who come. It's a producer-only market. You have to make what you sell. And so it's a place where people come in the morning and stay and listen to music all morning and chat with friends, and 2 hours later, they're still there. And a place really for, I've spent time praying with people who come through and share stories, or, it's a place where community happens, and there's kids' activities, older folks, all kinds of things. So people come because they want to experience the community that we have there. They chat with the growers. We talk about recipes. We talk about, what you cooked last week with the vegetables you bought. Jeff mentioned a lot of reasons why people come and buy local and buy organic produce. But the main reason people tell me again and again and again is I shop here and I buy this because it tastes good. I've never had vegetables like this. They're fresh. I buy lettuce from you and it lasts a week and a half in the refrigerator. That's almost creepy, Why is it lasting so long? I'm like, oh, well, because I picked it this morning. And so they tell me again and again, it's really easy to get my family to eat vegetables. It's easy to get my kids to eat healthily because the food tastes good. I had to throw in a picture of my daughter, and then the woman, the young lady on the left is we've had several young recent college graduates who have come to us and said, can you can we work on the farm with you over the summer? We want to learn more about farming. And this is kind of this interesting trend that's really heartwarming for me to see a whole generation now of young people who say, we want to return to the land, or we want some kind of a connection to the land. And I think part of it is she worked overseas as a volunteer, and then there's another young fellow who was in the Peace Corps for a couple of years. And part of their experience was they lived in rural communities, and they saw how agriculture was integral to the society there, and how that helped keep the community together. People would go and help each other out on their gardens, and women would spend time shelling beans together and chatting. And I think there's a longing to kind of recreate that. They said, we don't even see community like that in our churches in the States. And there's a real longing for that kind of recreation for community. And my daughter sold tomatoes this year. I had to. So my son and daughter both have to pick market projects. So while there are down times in the farming business, we try to work through some of those challenges. The hoop houses are great technology where you can continue to, even in Wisconsin, harvest, well, not this year, but most winters, you can keep harvesting spinach and some other real hardy greens all winter long, and it's not heated, it's just a solar heat. Some of the other challenges, there's the spinach. That was from last year. It doesn't look like that this year. But some of the other challenges that come along with farming are land, access to land. We've talked about, Chris talked about in urban areas, access to land is a struggle, but it's also an access for young people who want to get into farming. How do you get land? How do you find land that is suitable for farming and isn't all worn out? And so that's certainly a challenge. And Ryan and I had been talking about land issues and getting into farming, and I just, we will be inheriting this farm from my parents, and I just keep thinking, how do we use this land? And for those of you who have access to land, how do you use this land in ways that we can bring more people into farming who want to farm? So it's a challenge for us to think about how to best do that. Also, the finances of farming, to charge enough so you're making, kind of minimum wage at least, but also to price your produce in ways that, so it's fair and for everyone. We live in a blue-collar town, a lot of factory workers, and so the reason I'm selling vegetables is because I want people to have good quality produce, not just those who can pay a premium price for it, but so it's available to everyone. It's part of our ministry to the community. So I will leave you then with, there's an old order Mennonite farmer that we visited in upstate New York, and he and his other fellow church members in their community had, because of their moving to that area and bringing their farms with them, buying local farms, rejuvenating them, had revived several really small communities in upstate New York that were dying out and were really flourishing now. And his quote was, "Where agriculture flourishes, the other arts will follow." So I'll leave you to ponder that, and we really have enjoyed our time here, and thank you for having an interest in agriculture and how that intersects both internationally and locally.
Thank you. Thank you to all four of you for sharing. I have one question I just want to lead off with here, and as time allows, we'll take a couple questions from the audience. It seems like in many of these discussions, many of these experiences that you've shared, there seems to be a direct connection between restoring the natural ecological processes and healing of the land, and in fact transforming, as Dr. Miller used the word, and healing societies or culture or communities. I just wondered if you could share from maybe any of your personal experiences or your work certain components of transformation, whether that's ecologically or socially, that led to transformation, basically.
I'll start it off. For me, that's a really easy one. I work primarily with folks who don't really have a lot of resources, and maybe come from backgrounds that are unimaginable, really. And then to throw other struggles in there, such as being incarcerated or having children that you can barely afford, and all that. I've seen a lot of transformation in young men who've never had a job at the age of, till 25, never had a legitimate job, let's say. And to see someone really actually start to understand work and what it takes to, contribute to society positively is a powerful thing. And that's a transformation that we see every year and strive for,
One story I'd share is that last summer I started helping, when I wasn't working for my wife in the garden, I volunteered with the local community garden that a church not too far from us had started as part of what they're calling their Dream Center. And they've got lots of different ministries, but one was a community garden with an outreach to prisoners from the county prison. And they would bring women from the prison, mostly women. I think once or twice some men came, but it was mostly women that came. And they would work for 4 or 5 hours with us in the garden. And then those women decided that they wanted to start a garden at the prison. And they got permission from the prison to start a garden at the prison. And so they took the skills they had learned in our garden early in the season and planted a late season garden at the prison. Ultimately, some of the things they grew were eaten by other prisoners as part of their meals. So that was...
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe one or two?
Some of the stories, particularly you, Jeff, you talked about your love and connection with the land came from early childhood experiences, and I think many people experience that. But then looking at urban environments like Chris talked about, do you have any thoughts or ideas or dreams of how we can get those sorts of experiences or get urban people more connected with the land when they haven't got the chance necessarily to go to camps or limited opportunities to grow and slow? So it's not just the incarcerated who have this. Do any of you have thoughts about how, with such a large and growing urban population, we can get those sorts of connections to the land started in those populations?
I think starting in the schools. I think, and especially, we have a high school program, high school after school program. But I think even then, you're kind of getting them a little too late, and they're pretty distracted in high school. I would think to say that starting on a low-level grade school, even kindergarten, to have more gardens and as part of the curriculum in elementary, I think would be a good place to start.
Yeah, the hospital in our county has put a lot of money into wellness initiatives, and one of those has been getting more local and organic food into the diets of the people who work at the hospital, but also into local school systems. And so they've been funding initiatives. Even though it's a pretty rural county, there's still a lot of kids who don't ever garden or have access to gardens. And so some of the local elementary schools, and I think that's really important, have started their own school gardens, and then they have a chef in the classroom where a local chef will come and take some food and they'll cook it with the kids. They'll make sweet potato pizza or, I don't know, crazy things like that. But that's been well received.
I'm part of a Marion Community Garden Association in Indiana, and 4 years ago we started 8 community gardens in the city, and it started just basically by a survey from the mayor's office of what these blocks that were right near Indiana Wesleyan University, what their needs were. Did they want a clinic, an after-school program? And overwhelmingly, the survey showed that they wanted gardens. So it was from the bottom up. It wasn't that the mayor's office mandated it. And what's been interesting, I'm on the board now, and we just got a police report, because one of the things, the criticism was like, if you have these gardens, people are going to deface them, they're going to steal from it. But it turns out that if you looked at the statistics of the police report, that in the last 3 years, all the surrounding streets that abut any of these gardens have decreased crime. I think it's because the neighborhood is revived. In other words, they have some hope, some respect for that neighborhood. So,
Can I just say too that that the education of the real young kids is so important beyond just education in that it's their taste buds and it's what they get used to eating. And if they only eat really cheap, fast food and such because it's inexpensive from a young age, their taste buds are going to be shot by the time they're in high school. And it's good to start young.
Is there one last question? Well, why don't you join me in thanking all of our panelists one more time?